Most people believe strength means holding everything together, no matter how loud the storm gets inside. But what if the real reason you feel exhausted isn't because you're weak, and actually because you've been trying too hard to be strong in the wrong way? There's a quiet kind of strength that doesn't tighten your chest or steal your sleep. It doesn't demand that you silence your feelings or pretend you're fine. In fact, it begins the moment you stop fighting what you feel. If you've ever replayed a conversation long after it ended, or felt your heart race over words you wish you could forget, you're not alone, though it can feel that way at 3 in the morning. Some storms don't look dramatic from the outside. They just leave you tired, guarded, and unsure of yourself. This story is for those quiet battles no one applauds and few people see. It offers a way to stand steady without becoming hard, calm without becoming distant, a way to feel safe inside your own mind again. There's a small, almost invisible shift that can quiet the noise faster than distraction, faster than forcing positivity, faster even than time. It isn't complicated, and it doesn't require changing your life or becoming someone new. It begins with something so simple most people overlook it entirely. Yet once you see it, you can't unsee it, like noticing a hidden path that had been there all along. And the moment you step onto it, something inside you starts to settle. In the story you're about to hear, a tired soul discovers that the storms he feared weren't meant to be defeated, but understood. Through a quiet encounter and a humble, flickering lantern, he learns a form of resilience that feels more like coming home than pushing forward. You may recognize parts of yourself in his struggle, the doubt, the sensitivity, the longing to feel steady. And if you do, you might also recognize the gentle strength waiting beneath it. So if your heart has been carrying more than it lets on, stay for a moment. Let this be a place where you don't have to brace yourself or pretend, because sometimes the life-changing shift isn't learning how to fight harder. It's discovering how to stand peacefully while the wind moves around you. And once you feel that, even briefly, you begin to understand why some people become calm in ways that nothing seems to shake. The storms always seemed to find him without warning, usually on ordinary afternoons when nothing special was supposed to happen. One sharp word from a stranger, one memory drifting in like cold air, and suddenly his chest would tighten as if thunder were rolling inside it. He'd smile anyway, of course, because that's what strong people are meant to do, or so he'd been told. Yet behind the polite nods, his hands trembled slightly, like leaves pretending not to shake. Sometimes he wondered quietly if anyone else could hear the weather changing inside him. Anger came first, quick and hot, then grief trailing behind like heavy rain that wouldn't let up. Anxiety, though, was the worst. It hummed like distant thunder that never quite arrived, never quite left. He grew tired of bracing himself for skies no one else seemed to notice. At night, he would lie still, staring at the ceiling, as if stillness alone could trick the storm into passing him by. It never did, though it occasionally softened just enough to let him sleep. He had become skilled at appearing steady, almost admirable in his composure, the way a fragile glass might look solid until tapped. Friends called him dependable, calm even, which might have been funny if it didn't feel so lonely. Inside, he felt like a small lantern rattling on a hook in high wind, its light flickering not from weakness but from being exposed. He feared the moment the flame might go out entirely, so he guarded it, cupping it with invisible hands, hoping no one would notice how hard that was. There were days when he avoided conversations altogether, not out of dislike but out of caution. A careless comment could send sparks through dry grass, and he was so very tired of putting out fires no one else saw. When criticism came, even gentle, even deserved, it struck him like sudden hail, sharp and disorienting. He would nod, agree, retreat, then replay the moment again and again as if searching for shelter he'd missed. It left him wondering whether strength was supposed to feel this fragile. One evening, watching the wind bend the thin trees along his street, he caught himself envying them. They didn't fight the storm. They moved with it, bowed without shame, rose again without apology. It occurred to him, hesitantly, almost like a secret, that perhaps real strength wasn't the rigid kind he'd been practicing. Maybe it was something quieter, something that didn't shatter when the wind grew loud. And that small, uncertain thought lingered with him, like the first calm breath before another storm decides whether to stay or pass on. In the days that followed, he began to notice something peculiar about the storms within him. The more he resisted them, the louder they seemed to roar. It was like trying to smooth water with clenched fists, exhausting and strangely ineffective. One afternoon, After a tense exchange that left his pulse racing, he simply sat down on a park bench and did nothing at all. No rehearsing arguments, no scolding himself for feeling too much. Just sitting there, letting the wind move through the trees and, tentatively, through him. At first it felt wrong, almost irresponsible, as if calm were a form of surrender. Yet the longer he stayed, the more the inner thunder softened into something like distant waves. He noticed his feet on the ground, the slow rhythm of his breath, the surprising steadiness of the bench beneath him. The storm hadn't vanished, but it no longer seemed determined to carry him away. It circled, grumbled, then gradually lost interest. Like weather that realizes no one is running from it, he started experimenting in small, quiet ways, the sort no one else would ever notice. When irritation sparked, he let his shoulders drop instead of tightening them like armor. When sadness crept in, he placed a hand over his chest, not to suppress it, but to say wordlessly, "I see you." It felt awkward at first, a bit like learning to speak a language no one had taught him. Yet there was relief in the gentleness, as though he had finally stopped shouting at a frightened animal and begun coaxing it closer. The lantern inside him still shook, of course, but now he watched it with curiosity rather than dread. He realized the flame didn't need rigid walls to survive. It needed space, air, a steadier hand. Perhaps resilience wasn't about hardening into something unbreakable. Perhaps it was more like becoming a tree with deeper roots, flexible enough to sway without snapping. The idea settled into him slowly, like warmth returning to cold fingers. One evening, as clouds gathered again on the horizon, he felt the familiar tension rise, and surprisingly, a hint of readiness too. Not the kind that braces for impact, but the kind that stands quietly, knowing it doesn't have to fight the sky. He wasn't calm yet, not fully, but he sensed he was learning where calm might live, and somewhere in that awareness was the faint impression that someone, someday, might show him how to stand there without fear. By then, people had begun to notice the subtle distance in him, the way he sometimes paused a second too long before answering simple questions. At work, a colleague's careless joke once slipped past his defenses and left him shaken for hours, though he laughed along as if nothing had happened. He worried not about the joke itself, but about the flash of anger it had stirred. Sharp, unfamiliar, almost frightening. What if one day he didn't manage to hide it in time? The thought followed him home like a shadow that refused to fade. He had always feared becoming someone who hurt others without meaning to. As a child, he'd promised himself he would be gentle, dependable, the kind of person people felt safe around. Yet lately, his emotions felt like loose wires sparking behind the walls, unpredictable and quietly dangerous. When he grew overwhelmed, he withdrew, answering messages late, declining invitations with polite excuses. It seemed safer to disappear for a while than risk letting the storm spill onto someone else. Late at night, he would sit by the window watching the empty street, replaying moments where he'd nearly lost control. A raised voice here, a trembling hand there, small signs that his balance was slipping. He imagined how easily trust could crack, how quickly one harsh reaction could undo years of careful kindness. The lantern inside him flickered wildly on those nights, its light stretching thin, as though uncertain it could keep burning. He wondered if stability was something people were simply born with, like a talent he'd somehow missed. What he wanted most wasn't admiration or even peace, but reliability, the quiet confidence that he could face any feeling without being swept away by it. He longed to trust his own reactions, to speak without second-guessing every tone and word. Sometimes he practiced alone, whispering responses to imaginary confrontations, trying to sound calm and grounded. It felt a little silly, like rehearsing for a play no one would attend, yet he kept doing it anyway. Hope, after all, can be stubborn in the gentlest way. On particularly heavy days, he pressed his palm lightly against his chest, as if steadying that trembling lantern from the outside. He'd close his eyes, breathe once, twice, waiting for the shaking to slow even slightly. It helped, though he couldn't explain why. Just a small pocket of stillness in a noisy room. He began to suspect that somewhere, hidden beneath the chaos, there was a steadier version of himself waiting to be found, and it was around that time, when the search felt both urgent and fragile, that someone unexpected stepped quietly into his path. It happened on a gray morning when the wind had been restless since dawn, nudging doors, rattling loose signs, as if the day itself couldn't settle. On his way to the bus stop, he noticed a small lantern hanging outside a modest shop. its metal frame worn but carefully polished. Each gust sent it swaying in wide, frantic arcs, the fragile light inside stuttering as though unsure it wanted to remain. He slowed without meaning to, watching it struggle against forces it couldn't see. Something about it felt uncomfortably familiar. The shopkeeper, busy arranging crates, didn't seem concerned at all, as if the lantern's wild swinging were simply part of the morning. Yet to him it looked one strong gust away from breaking loose entirely. He imagined the glass shattering on the pavement, the flame vanishing in a soft, final sigh. The thought tightened his chest, not because of the lantern itself, but because it mirrored the way his own composure felt lately. Held together, yes, but only just. He found himself returning the next day, then the next, pretending to check his phone while secretly watching the little light dance in the wind. Sometimes it moved gently, almost gracefully, when the air was kind. Other times it jerked sharply, knocking against the wall with a dull, hollow sound that made him wince. He wondered how something so small could endure such constant disturbance without simply giving up. The question lingered long after he boarded the bus. One afternoon, during a sudden burst of rain, he stepped under the shop's narrow awning and stood close enough to see the tiny flame inside. It flickered furiously, but did not go out, protected by the thin glass that trembled with every gust. Instinctively, he placed a hand over his own chest again, feeling his heartbeat echo the lantern's unsteady rhythm. For a brief moment, man and object seemed to share the same fragile persistence. He almost smiled at the odd comfort of it. As the storm eased, the lantern's swinging slowed to a gentle sway, like a tired pendulum finally allowed to rest. He noticed how the flame straightened when the motion softened, growing calm without needing to burn any brighter. It occurred to him that perhaps stability wasn't about extinguishing the wind, but about finding a way to move without losing the light. The idea felt important, though he couldn't yet say why. Just then, he became aware that someone had been standing quietly beside him, watching the lantern too, as if waiting for the exact moment to speak. The person beside him was older, though not in a way that felt distant, more like a tree that had simply stood through many seasons. She held a paper cup of tea between her hands, warming them, her gaze resting on the lantern with easy familiarity. When a sharp gust made it clatter against the wall, he flinched, but she didn't even blink. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something softer than the wind. Her calm felt almost out of place, like still water in a rushing stream. "You're worried it might fall," she said gently, not as a question but as a quiet observation. He hesitated, then nodded, a little embarrassed by how obvious it suddenly seemed. She smiled in a way that made the admission feel safe rather than foolish. "It's not afraid of the wind," she continued. "It just learned how to hang on." The words were simple, yet they settled into him with surprising weight. He studied her then, noticing how relaxed her shoulders were, how steady her breathing remained despite the restless air. There was no tension in her posture, no urgency to control what couldn't be controlled. She stood there as if storms were merely passing visitors, not threats to be fought off. It made him wonder what she knew that he didn't, what quiet practice allowed someone to remain so unshaken. The question hovered between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Sensing it, she shifted her cup to one hand and placed the other lightly against the wall, as though demonstrating something invisible. "Most people try to stop the wind," she said softly, "but that only makes them tired." Her fingers tapped the brick once, a grounding, deliberate motion. "The trick is to root yourself so deeply that the wind has nothing to grab." He wasn't entirely sure what she meant, yet something in his chest loosened at the possibility. Another gust swept through, lifting the lantern into a brief, frantic dance before letting it settle again. This time he didn't flinch. He watched the movement with her quiet attentiveness, curious rather than afraid. For the first time, the storm felt less like an enemy and more like a teacher, speaking a language he was just beginning to understand. He had the sense that if he stayed a little longer, she might show him how to listen, and somehow, that felt like the beginning of something he hadn't known he was waiting for. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More 2 Bonus for you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. They began meeting by the shop without ever formally agreeing to it, as if the quiet itself had arranged the appointments. One morning, When the air was unusually still, she invited him to stand where the lantern's shadow fell across the ground. "Notice your feet," she said gently, as though pointing out something obvious he had somehow overlooked. He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the pavement beneath his shoes, solid and patient. It felt strangely reassuring, like being introduced to an old friend he'd never properly greeted. "Storms pull upward," she continued, her voice soft enough that he had to lean in slightly to hear. "They lift thoughts, fears, memories. Everything starts spinning." She placed her cup aside and took one slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling like a calm tide. Without quite deciding to, he matched her rhythm, inhaling carefully, exhaling even slower. The effect was subtle, but undeniable, as though someone had lowered the volume of a noise he'd grown used to enduring. She showed him how to press his tongue lightly against the roof of his mouth, how to let his hands rest open instead of clenched, small adjustments that felt almost too simple to matter. Yet with each one, the restless buzzing inside him softened a little more. "Gentleness isn't weakness," she said with a faint smile, noticing his surprise. "It's what keeps the glass from cracking." He glanced at the lantern, remembering how the flame steadied whenever the swinging eased. When a memory surfaced, a harsh word from weeks before, still sharp at the edges, she encouraged him not to push it away. "Just let it pass through," she murmured, tracing a slow line in the air as if guiding an invisible current. He tried, half expecting the feeling to swell out of control, but it didn't. It rose, hovered, then drifted onward like a cloud that had lost its storm. For the first time, he sensed that his emotions weren't traps but movements, changing if given space. Before leaving, she tapped the ground lightly with her foot, the same quiet gesture she'd used against the wall days earlier. "When the wind comes," she said, "come back here first." He knew she meant not the pavement, but the steadiness it represented, the present moment, simple and unremarkable, yet impossible to uproot. As he walked away, he noticed the sky beginning to darken again, the first hints of another storm gathering. This time, though, he felt a small, steady place inside him waiting to be found. The next storm didn't announce itself with thunder, just a tense conversation that turned sharp without warning. He felt the familiar surge rising, heat in his chest, words lining up too quickly behind his teeth. For a split second he almost reacted the old way, fast and defensive. Then he remembered her foot tapping lightly against the ground, the quiet invitation to return. So he paused, pressed his feet into the floor, and let one slow breath move through him like a steady hand. It didn't erase the feeling, not at all, but it created a small space around it, like clearing a circle in tall grass. The other person kept speaking, unaware of the fragile shift taking place in front of them. He noticed the weight of his arms, the texture of the table beneath his fingertips, the surprising steadiness of his own voice when he finally answered. The storm was still there, rumbling softly, yet it no longer controlled the direction of the conversation. That alone felt like a quiet miracle. Later, walking home, he realized his hands weren't trembling the way they usually did after conflict. Instead, there was a cautious confidence, as if he had crossed a narrow bridge and discovered it was stronger than it looked. He passed the little shop and saw the lantern swaying gently in the evening breeze. Not frantic this time, just moving as if it trusted the hook that held it. He smiled without quite meaning to, recognizing the change in both of them. Stability, it seemed, could grow in small, almost invisible increments. Of course, there were setbacks too. Moments when the wind caught him off guard and the old reactions flared before he could stop them. On those days, he resisted the urge to scold himself, remembering her voice reminding him that gentleness keeps the glass intact. He would place a hand over his chest, breathe once, sometimes twice, letting the shaking settle instead of fighting it. Oddly enough, those quieter recoveries felt more powerful than any flawless performance. They proved he could return, again and again, without losing his way entirely. One evening he stood beneath the lantern as a stronger gust sent it swinging wide, its light flashing across the wall in restless arcs. Instead of anxiety, he felt a strange sense of kinship, as though he understood the motion from the inside now. The flame steadied sooner than before, drawing itself upright with quiet determination. Watching it, he sensed that something in him had rooted more deeply than he'd realized, and he wondered, not without a flicker of anticipation, how this new steadiness might hold when life tested it where it mattered most. The test arrived on an ordinary morning, disguised as a misunderstanding that quickly spiraled into accusation. A co-worker's voice grew sharp, eyes narrowed, the kind of confrontation that once would have sent his pulse racing out of control. He felt the first gust inside him, sudden and forceful, urging him to defend, to push back, to escape. For a heartbeat he nearly obeyed, the old reflex reaching for the wheel. Then he remembered the pavement beneath his feet, the lantern that steadied when it stopped fighting the air. He pressed his toes subtly into the floor, a small anchoring no one else could see, and let one slow breath travel downward instead of outward. The words thrown at him still stung, of course, but they no longer pierced as deeply. He listened, really listened, not to surrender, but to remain present enough to choose his response. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, clear in a way that surprised even him. The tension in the room shifted, not dramatically, just enough to loosen its grip. The coworker blinked, caught off guard by the absence of resistance, as though expecting thunder and receiving only steady rain. Questions replaced accusations, the sharp edge dulling into something closer to confusion than anger. He noticed how calm felt almost contagious, spreading through the space in gentle ripples. It wasn't victory, not the triumphant kind people imagine, but it was something better, a quiet de-escalation that left everyone standing. He realized then that strength could be disarming without being forceful. Later, someone else approached him, curious about how he'd managed not to react. He shrugged lightly, unsure how to explain something that felt more like remembering than learning. "I just paused," he said, offering a small, almost shy smile. Inside, though, he knew it had been more than a pause. It had been a return to that steady place she'd shown him, a return to the ground that didn't shift even when everything else did. That evening, he walked past the shop again, noticing the lantern glowing steadily, despite the restless wind tugging at its frame. For a moment, he imagined all the unseen storms people carried as they passed beneath it. Arguments, disappointments, silent loneliness. He felt an unexpected tenderness for them, a quiet wish that they too might find something to hold on to. And as he lingered there, he sensed that his steadiness was no longer only for himself, but for moments still waiting just ahead. A few days later, as they stood beneath the lantern's patient glow, she asked him to try something that seemed almost too simple to matter. "Stand as if your feet have roots," she said, tapping the ground lightly with her shoe. He obeyed, feeling faintly self-conscious at first, like a child pretending to be a tree in a school play. Yet as he pressed his weight downward, he noticed how the rest of his body softened, as though the effort of holding himself up had quietly shifted elsewhere. The sensation was oddly comforting, like being supported from below instead of bracing from above. "Now breathe as if the air is moving through those roots," she added, demonstrating with a slow, unhurried inhale. He followed, imagining the breath traveling downward instead of crowding his chest. On the exhale, his shoulders dropped a fraction, tension slipping away without needing to be pushed. The lantern above them swayed gently, its flame unwavering, as if approving of the exercise. He couldn't help but smile at the thought that steadiness might be practiced in under a minute. She encouraged him to try it whenever the wind rose inside, during criticism, in moments of shame, even in the quiet ache of loneliness that sometimes crept in without warning. "You don't have to fix the storm," she reminded him softly. "Just remember where the ground is." He pictured himself doing it in crowded rooms, on silent bus rides, in the privacy of his own kitchen after a difficult call. The practice felt portable, invisible, something he could carry without anyone needing to know. That night, lying awake as old worries began their familiar circling, he planted his heels gently into the mattress and imagined roots spreading downward through the floor. It was a strange image, a little whimsical, yet it calmed him faster than any distraction ever had. He placed one hand over his chest, not to quiet the feeling, but to accompany it, the way she had taught him. Gradually, the noise in his mind softened into something like distant rain. Sleep found him there, grounded and unguarded. In the days that followed, he noticed how often people spoke of being swept away, knocked over, or left adrift by their emotions. He wondered what might change if they knew they could simply stand still instead. Passing the lantern one evening, he watched its steady glow and imagined countless unseen roots holding it in place. The thought filled him with a quiet hope that spread outward, touching not just his own storms but those still gathering beyond him, and it left him sensing that the calm he was learning might one day become a shelter for someone else too. Seasons shifted quietly, almost shyly, and with them came storms fiercer than any he had faced before. Yet when the winds rose, he no longer felt like something fragile about to be carried away. He stood as he had practiced, feet grounded, breath slow, the lantern inside him steady even when the world blurred at the edges. People began to notice, not because he spoke about it, but because his calm seemed to soften the air around him. It was the kind of strength that didn't announce itself, only revealed itself in difficult moments. One afternoon, a stranger snapped at him in a crowded line, frustration spilling over from a day that had clearly been too heavy. The old version of him would have absorbed the sting for hours or returned it with equal sharpness. Instead, he felt the familiar surge, acknowledged it, and let it pass through like wind through branches. His reply was gentle, almost disarming, and the stranger's shoulders dropped, as if released from an invisible grip. He realized then that calm could ripple outward, touching storms that weren't even his own. He still visited the shop sometimes, though the wise woman was not always there. On those days he would stand beneath the lantern alone, watching its patient sway, remembering how lost he had once felt. The flame no longer looked fragile to him. It looked resilient in a quiet, unassuming way. He understood now that gentleness wasn't the absence of strength, but its most enduring form. The realization settled into him like warmth that didn't fade with the weather. As weeks turned into months, people began to linger near him during tense moments, as if drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Conversations that might have escalated softened in his presence, voices lowering, expressions easing. He didn't try to fix anyone or offer advice. He simply remained steady, a living reminder that storms could pass without destruction. It was a strange, humbling role, becoming an anchor without intending to be one. Yet it felt natural, like fulfilling a promise he hadn't known he'd made. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in quiet gold, he watched the lantern glowing softly against the coming dusk. It swayed just enough to remind him that the wind would always exist, that calm wasn't the absence of movement but the grace within it. He placed a hand lightly over his chest, not out of necessity now, but out of gratitude for the steadiness he'd found. In that peaceful moment, he sensed that the true measure of strength was not how fiercely one resisted chaos, but how gently one could remain kind within it. And the light continued to glow, patient and enduring, ready for whatever weather might come next.